A universe of questions, cloaked amidst laws set in motion since the dawn of time, perceived solely by those determined, and found only between the realms of black and white. Welcome to the Gray Matters Podcast.
There are moments in time that hold secrets to our instinctual, individual human nature. Moments that provide us a deeper awareness of our subconscious mind. Wounds and victory that are exposed in these moments. They're usually made manifest by responsive or emotional reaction. In addition to the subconscious mind, there's a much more sentient element in the composition of human nature, which is shaped and transformed through the process of expression, observation, and experience. This is the conscious mind, and this acts as the building blocks of perceived personality. This is the essence of our individual daily being. It's typically made manifest by thoughtful and cognizant reaction. Our reputation, our ambitions, perspective, inclinations, influence, these are all products of both the conscious and the subconscious being. We're composed of those things that we have shaped and those things that others have shaped in us. The mind is an amazing thing, and I welcome you to join me, Brandon Kenyon, as I tell you a tale of human essence, of what shapes us, of self-awareness. Yet another chapter in the saga of the mind I like to call Gray Matters.
A few words before we get started. Firstly, a word of caution that this episode contains some depictions of terror and violence that may not be suitable for younger listeners. Please proceed with caution. Additionally, this is the second part of a two-part story, and if you haven't listened to the first, go do that, then come back to finish. Now let's get on with the conclusion of the story. The Machine That Told Time, Part 2.
I have a rendezvous with death. At some disputed barricade, when spring comes back with rustling shade and apple blossoms fill the air. I have a rendezvous with death. When spring brings back blue days and fair, it may be he shall take my hand and lead me into his dark land, and close my eyes and quench my breath. It may be I shall pass him still. I have a rendezvous with death on some scarred slope of battered hill, when spring comes round again this year, and the first meadow flowers appear. God knows 'twere better to be deep, pillowed in silk and scented down, where love throbs out in blissful sleep, pulse nigh to pulse, and breath to breath, where hushed awakenings are dear. But I've a rendezvous with death, at midnight in some flaming town, when spring trips north again this year, and I to my pledged word am true. I shall not fail that rendezvous.
I was in Callahan's, clueless to how long I'd waited to take a sip of my coffee. I was alone at my table, against the bay-facing windows that gave a barrier from the noise of the cacophony of the city patrons trying to make their way home. They were also childlike, simple. I remember feeling envious of their ignorance. My heart pulled into my stomach as I saw moment of demise devices displayed proudly on infants holding hands with their parents. I wanted to be like them. I imagined my wife Mallory and I walking the boardwalk, proudly displaying our mods. She'd be smiling, genuinely, something I haven't seen since longevity scores were implemented. I'd be able to roll with her capricious request to suddenly run, stop, sit, and just stare into the lapping waves on the shoreline. Detective Graham's face was constituted with worry, though if I didn't know him since my time serving in the NYPD warrants, I would have mistaken his expression as sheer terror. His already hesitant step across the entry threshold became even more apprehensive after reading the greeting message posted on the server booth. The header of the sign read, "No longevity required," and was followed by 3 points in antiquity font. For a cup of joe or a friendly smile, to small talk without judgment, and because we still believe that you're a human being. Graham made a mad dash for my window side table, unfalteringly staring forward. I couldn't help but smile. The small restaurant was quaint, modeled after a traditional Irish pub. The rustic chandeliers, the oversized wood doors, wild game mounted above the cashier's table, and nearly every piece of furniture had been imported to establish the authenticity of their origins. The interior paneling was constructed of beautiful logs, dimly glowing yellowish red from the incandescent ceiling-mounted lighting. It was a calm setting, and maintained a comfortable, laid-back atmosphere with the sparse tables dotting the center of the room, chairs hand-assembled from heavy wooden logs, burls and limbs left intact to create character specific to each table and each seat. My table, a booth, like all the perimeter booths, were strategically set up at each exterior window. Graham's forward-leaning pace and locked vision with my table was a shame. He was missing the beauty of the custom craftsmanship. "Healy," he said in a moderately quiet tone. "What happened to you, man? I turned for 2 seconds and you're pulling out of the parking lot. The scene's already been cleaned up. I had to call Garner. He actually told me not to bother you. He sent Johnson out for analysis." There was an extended pause. "What happened, Harry?" He knew I wasn't going to answer his inquiries, and quite frankly, I didn't know how to answer him. I didn't know how to explain the nightmares and my irrational fear of the mod, or the elusive man that was threatening me. I didn't know how to properly ask questions about Heather Bennett and Dustin Harmon's murders, about my own sanity. Graham hadn't come to Callahan's to catch up or check in as a concerned associate, not with his apprehension about crossing the threshold of a modless den of lions. The waitress gave the uneasy standstill some reprieve when she cut into our conversation and asked if we wanted a cup of coffee, granting an opportunity for me to pivot the subject. Black, ma'am." She turned his cup right side up and poured. It was getting late, and he undoubtedly had no intention of drinking it, but I'm certain he didn't want to draw any attention to himself. On more than one occasion, he pulled his long-sleeve shirt down to confirm his mod was carefully concealed from the coffee shop patrons. Before he had the opportunity to refocus, I quickly pivoted the conversation. "Graham, do you remember the Heather Bennett case? It's about 4 weeks ago. Neighborhood on the other side of the bridge. She was attacked." Graham's face tightened up as he stared into his dark brew. "I remember we were told not to discuss cases with you until you pulled your act together. And I get the feeling you're not asking about it because you want to send the family flowers, Harry. Look, you're pale, you're thin. You look like you haven't slept or eaten in days." I turned to face him and inarguably belted, "I'm fine!" My voice carried through the restaurant, and all seemed at once to hush to an ear-splitting silence. Confusion dotted Graham's face as we stared at each other, the steam from our coffee cups building a malformed barricade between us. I was perfectly comfortable with the silence, but I could tell Graham, however, was discomforted by the entirety of the situation, which prompted him to snap to his feet, grab his NYPD jacket, and slap a balled-up $5 bill on the table before turning for the exit. "You know," Graham paused, not turning his face to me, "I told Garner to let you on this case. That was me, and he was right. I put a lot of my own time on the line just to get you another chance, Harry, and I never should have sacrificed for you. Heather Bennett. Yeah, I remember the case. She died because she didn't have a mod. Just like everybody else I've dealt with for the last 6 months. And I don't want to get the call one day that you wound up in a ditch just because you had to be different. Harry, playtime's over. Don't do it for me. Heck, don't even do it for yourself. Do it for Mallory. Your wife deserves better than to worry about her future with a man on the verge of snapping. You're seeing exactly what I see every day. And it's too dangerous to risk ruining everyone else's life around you just to make a who knows what sort of statement. Harry, I hope you get better. He walked towards the door, slapping the welcome sign to the ground with a metallic clamor, hesitating to stand it up only momentarily before speeding hastily to a squad car, but not before pulling up his sleeve to reveal his mod to the rest of the world.
Reader, if you've stuck with me thus far, I pray you're doing more than simply bolstering your societal programming or placating your already exhausted conscience. My burden of responsibility is being shifted, as I've seen enough to drive any man to rash decisions or disassociation. I'm certain you still have many questions, but I owe you the context and the intellect to bring cadence to what you see on display in my bedroom before you. Do you remember the early days when the mod's ability to quickly adjust its countdown to your last moments, your downfall, that struck fear in the core of who you were as a human being? Almost as if someone was robbing you of your humanity, taking all the guesswork out of the definitions of right and wrong, or good and bad, righteous and evil. Pause and try to remember those moments. Remember the concern for future generations of children that would live their lives with a bracelet that acted like their own personal doomsday clock. If you were normal, this was concerning. My wife Mallory and I would speak boldly against the device when we went out, as did everyone, it seemed. We watched as those with mods seemed to simply distance themselves from loved ones. That used to make the evening news. Then the statistics started rolling in. No one ever questioned the statistics. Youth drug experimentation was nearly eradicated. All forms of cancer seemed all but gone. Obesity, diabetes, teen pregnancy, gun violence, suicide, all in an accelerated decline. Dawn and Khalid, my peculiar next-door neighbors, were the first I'd met to sport a mod. They made it a point to evangelize the device to our entire community. I can remember seeing the countdown timer shifting rapidly with every impulsive motion they made. Seconds pulsing up and down as they reached for a cup of coffee. I think it's too hot. You got any ice cubes, Mallory? Still trying to work out how much I should keep an eye on this thing. He began to loosen the band to take it off and then paused and tightened it back up. I'm figuring it's probably healthy to take a peek at it every couple of hours, just to make sure I'm not seeing any dramatic drops. He proceeded to glance at his wrist to check his mod every 30 seconds. I was, at first, confused by the device, as I'm certain you were as well, reader. I remember seeing Dawn weep on the front sidewalk curb, lamenting her indulgence and melancholy throughout the years after seeing the expensive time she had charged to her days remaining on Earth. She had recently had a bout with depression, as often she did, and her mod did not react kindly to her sorrow, shaving nearly 2 months off of her timer in a matter of moments of depression, which caused further misery. Khalid came to my door one morning asking about Dawn. She disappeared. His face was stoic.
He held no emotion for fear of disrupting the mod's sensitive algorithms. I offered him a bed, which was declined after stepping past the threshold of my doorway and glancing at his mod. Shortly after Don's disappearance, Khalid's stiff and pale body was pulled out of his home by paramedics and, last I'd heard, his mod retention data was the basis for an early case study focused on moment-of-demise biometric tracking improvements. It took less than 3 weeks to make programmable logic controllers, simple binary machines, out of both Khalid and Dawn. Mallory and I used to have regularly scheduled Tuesday dinners with a rotating group of couples from the precinct and our circle of friends. This was, of course, until longevity scores bewitched every developed nation seemingly overnight. It was the perfect match for any of the deviants who didn't feel the obligatory pull to prescribe to the proposed health benefits of the mod. Longevity was the new social enticement that drew the masses, seamlessly integrating into social media platforms and shamelessly proselytizing class delineation of higher and lower longevity scores. Initially, I must admit that my reasonable defaults seemed to rally with this new fad. I mean, what harm is there in encouraging a war of healthy habits? The more you made your mod happy, the more you could gloat to your digital followers, creating a culture of healthy decision, right? It wasn't until longevity scores transitioned to the very baseline for social order that I realized the intrinsic harm. Prescribe or be marked as the opposition, the detractor. Our Tuesday night dinners came to an end, as did our closeness with any other couples. Restaurants became longevity level segregated and then exclusive. Credit application algorithms began to account for your mod longevity score. Every day I heard of relationships severed on account of longevity score divides. I don't know if Mallory ever forgave me for my aversion to the mod and social scoring, but I have to believe that she still sees a weeping young girl on the sidewalk outside of our home, desperate for happiness in the face of scornful affinity, a life of servitude and no allowable regrets, one without humanity and spontaneity. Longevity was never adopted because people suddenly started to realize they didn't know right from wrong. It was crafted as the single greatest and inhumane marketing campaign introduced in my lifetime. Now the evening news appeased the herd of egotistical sheep, further subdividing in the name of journalism, as they often do. Reader, I am not a monster, nor a madman. I have the luxury of feeling as I intend to, and indulging as I desire. As I finish the story of what led me to pen these words, remember a time before the discord in contrast, when we were separated only as far as the strands of sympathy would allow. Oil pastel paintings were developing in the storm gutters outside the precinct as I waited in the downpour for Grace and Officer Adams to finish up their daily wrap under the front facility awning. They were blocking the entrance, and I wanted to look through the Heather Bennett case again to get some answers. I hadn't had an opportunity, or maybe I wasn't desperate enough until this point, to locate the case file and review the details. I imagined they were talking about me. Odds were I was the topic of a lot of office conversation these days. Grace gave a distant playful yelp and then leaned forward to slap Adam's shoulder, which prompted an immediate chuckle, followed by an obvious peek at its mod. Grace mindlessly followed in suit. It was quiet for a few moments as I strained my eyes to peer across the parking lot through the hazy downpour, shielded only by shrubbery and 2 final parked cars in the illuminated parking lot. Drive safe," Adams spoke in a much more solemn tone. I figured the immediate shift in their demeanor either had to do with the recognition of daylight having faded or they'd just gotten a little too flirty. Either way, it was obvious that their mod took issue with the situation. I couldn't shake the certainty echoing from Graham's conclusion in the Heather Bennett case. She was murdered. That much was undeniable. Anyone who'd put eyes on those crime scene photos would be compelled to conclude the same. I had an obligation to review the case file. I didn't dare bring my vehicle to the precinct. Too much potential to spotlight my presence. My walk in the dismal torrential downpour from Callahan's was filled with sporadic manifestation of cerebrating debate. Was a murder now discounted at the expense of a healthcare device? Of social abnormality? Was Heather's death simply to be used as fodder to help drive metrics or key performance indicators? Why the attention on her death? What about her life? What about my life? What about Mallory? As I pen these words and ponder on what transpired that night, I wonder, what is it that the dead fear? Could it be that we the living are the awkward youth of eternity, fearing dreadfully in the face of inevitable maturity? I mean, our cultural obsession with death has supplemented our inability to live, to enjoy our youth before the tragic onset of the unknown. I slid across the flooding lot and helped myself into the office, and then to my laptop, which rarely left my workspace. Puddles of muddy rainwater and the tan carpet trailed me through the foyer and cubicles. I was known for working well into the evening, oftentimes the final day worker out of the facility as the handful of evening beat cops took to their patrol vehicles, then proceeded to avoid the streets at all costs, usually congregating at a cafe until the morning sun rid the streets of the defiant and denounced. This was different. The office pulsed with a roaring stillness. Rain pattered rhythmically against the windows and glass entry doors. I left the lights off to avoid putting myself on full display to anyone who might have been passing by, though I know how ignorant that may seem to you. I'm sure you're convinced that anybody with any sense of dignity would avoid the night. The case number for Heather Bennett was stored on the incomplete text file I had drafted seemingly ages ago. My breathing was erratic and frenzied, and I found it difficult to determine the cause of my deep shuddering. The cold and rain, the covert adrenaline, the dread of what I might uncover. Whatever the cause, I needed to act quickly, and I wasn't even certain of what exactly I was hoping to find, but I was certain I needed to find a loose thread. I quickly entered the case number into the NYPD case repository and was met with a photo of the victim, Heather. An older photo. Her eyes were vibrantly smiling, almost stubbornly, beneath her straight-cut bangs. "Just watch me," her eyes whispered. "I'm gonna be somebody special." She held a diploma against her blue satin graduation gown. Heather Elliott Bennett. Under her name and cause of death was the case status. Case closed. Judgment satisfied. No offender listed. The docket cataloged witness statements and referenced the crime scene photographs, none of which I'd seen before. I briefly questioned whether or not I'd opened the correct case file, cross-checking the case number and Heather's name again. My body continued vibrating to the point where it was difficult to palm my mouse correctly. The crime scene perimeter was established in every photo attached to this case directory, a clear distinction from what I vividly recalled. My laptop notepad descriptively spelled out images that were nowhere to be found. No grimacing phantom was seen in any of the photographs. As I quickly scrolled through the album, one photograph caught my attention. It seemed oddly familiar, a close-up of Heather's modless wrist. I checked my notes. It had been nearly impossible for me to have seen this photo if not included in the original case file. My entire body locked as I realized that I'd seen this image on an evening news report that made light of Heather's murder. presumed from a journalist. Except, there's no way for any journalist to access these images. They had to be granted, gifted, willingly. My mind pulsed with ideas of conspiratorial plot. Garner? Graham? Mallory? What would be the point of guising the cold-blooded killing of a young woman? Why was I the only one who seemed to notice, or seemed to care? I pored through the witness statements, which were, for the most part, devoid of critical detail. No one saw the incident occur, and most were laced with personal theories and opinion. Testimonials are covert confession booths for the traumatized, seizing the tragedy as an opportunity to come to grips with one's own failures, or sometimes unconsciously constructing a justification for them. You can tell a lot about a person by disambiguating their statements. One of the testimonies within the report spoke very tragically of Heather's demise. And to the average inspector, her comments could have been misconstrued as an empathetical attempt to identify with the bludgeoned victim. She looks like she was hurting. This statement was made by Amanda Dell. I've no doubt the majority of detective interpretations would have ended in a hearty chuckle and a dismissal. Of course she was hurting, they'd retort. She was beat to death. Heather Bennett died in the gutter that swept past a mature red maple. The red maple cast its shadow on the sidewalk I'd seen in those crime scene photos. The tree's shadow once concealed the distorted visage of a man with a horrifying grin. The tree stood tall in front of a home owned by the young girl that I'd seen once. In that photo, reaching for Heather with a painful passion. Heather Bennett was murdered in front of Amanda Dell's home. I needed to speak with Amanda Dell. It would be a long walk in the rain. The sideways downpour of hazy rain caused a shroud of pervasive darkness to the city streets. The gas-lit streetlights did little to illuminate my path, offering only murky waystones as I quickly trudged through the city. I wanted to collapse. My legs pulsed with ache, my head throbbed from sleep deprivation, my eyes burned feverishly. Do it for Mallory. That's what Graham told me before leaving Callahan's. I couldn't recall if it was earlier today or 2 days ago that he had said that to me, and it didn't matter. I told myself repeatedly on that walk to Amanda's house, I was doing this for the one person that cared about me, that I cared about. Looking back, I think I was doing little to help Mallory. I was doing this for myself. Survival's a great self-motivator. The streetlights oscillated as I struggled to keep my head from bobbing with each step. I was only about a quarter mile from Amanda's house when I started wondering how she would receive me, showing up at her doorstep soaked and moodless, distressed. With an end of my expedition in mind, I picked up pace. The streetlights began to dance with life, palpitating, contorting. I watched intensely as they took shape and blushed sporadically with hues of blues and orange. Smiles began to take shape within the luminescence, curling slowly and then rendering back to their original form as they danced in the sky. They were a breadcrumb trail that I seemed to be mystifyingly escorted by, bringing both comfort and terror to the streets that I knew so well. The pulsing grins, they began to open, and then close, and then open again. They were laughing at me. The sound of my feet colliding with the concrete began to reverberate up through my shins and knees. I picked up speed, purely fueled by the panicked horror that surrounded me. The gas lights began to leave trailing lighting artifacts as I turned my head left and right, filling the entire sky with smeared multichromatic mockery. My legs began to buckle, senses overwhelmed, heart rhythmically pounding and surrounded entirely by the truest horror I had up until that time ever experienced. And then I saw it. The mature red maple, less than 100 yards away. It all stopped. The aching, the lights, the trails in the sky. Through the downpour and the clouded haze, I saw a singular, silhouetted animation against the painted backdrop. A top hat, tattered, atop a tall, thin man in a soaking suit jacket. He was staring at his glowing wrist, which illuminated his face. I watched as the lean man awkwardly stepped, then paused, never glancing up from his mod. He was mid-street, only feet away from where I had seen the mangled, twisted body of Heather Bennett in the gutter. I was at a full standstill, uncertain of whether to hide or remain in the open, concealed by the rain and lack of glowing mod. I squinted, trying to get a clear view of the man's face. I wanted to know if this was the same man I had seen near Seward Park. He stepped again, and then paused, continuing to stare at his wrist. Then, almost as if being rewound, he stepped backwards and paused. He pivoted a few degrees and stepped again, right into the front lawn of the house across the street from Amanda Dell's residence. I rarely attribute encounters as fate, as it's always seemed too conveniently gimmicky for one to resort to metaphysical intervention in lieu of happenstance, but, reader, this moment was preordained, and I now know that one's own self-will has much influence over the laws of fate, though the predetermined ultimate end seems unlikely to have any concern for the will of one man, especially a man stubborn enough to challenge the destiny of our demise. Then again, for me, at this moment, my final words have yet to be penned. The front house light flickered on, fully illuminating the man in the top hat as well as the small yard. There was no movement in the man. He simply stared at his mod. I slowly began to make my way towards Amanda's house, concealed in the overture of rain, my vision fixed on the yard across the street. Suddenly, as before, the man snapped his head up quickly to peer at the house. He stood still for a few moments, completely unaffected by the bold, exposing light, and then produced what appeared to be a jagged piece of scrap metal. It reflected brilliantly through the droplets of magnifying rain and haze as he stood brazenly. From just under the brim of his top hat, I recognized his terrifying grin begin to take shape. I imagined his teeth were still stained with crimson, slowly purified by the water draining into the soil. I was spellbound with horror. He was going to do it again, and I was going to watch. His body came to life, snapping into motion towards the front door of the house. His lanky stride made quick work of the remaining space to the entry steps, which he scaled without effort before stopping, glancing at his mod, and slowly raising his other hand into the air, still grasping the metal object. Then he froze. I remember my body responding to the anticipation with a vibrating anxiety, locked on the image of a malformed profile, grasping an unbranded metal blade. I like to imagine that in this long pause, he was contemplating sparing the residents. My vision waned, mouth unconsciously open from the sheer inability to close it, and my legs trembled. I looked on at the malformed spine on the Cheshire man as he stood still, staring contently at his wrist. All at once, the man snapped his head up and began insistently pounding on the entryway door. not worried in the least about waking the residents of the neighborhood. 10, 15, 30 knocks. He didn't let up, each strike sending shockwaves through the air and causing me to unconsciously respond. I found myself stepping backwards, posturing against the gales until my legs could no longer sustain, and I surrendered my body, intoxicated with exhaustion and dread, into the muddy earth. I could no longer move. I'd inadvertently stepped into the very objective of my abusive evening, and now, between the very cause of my distress in front of me and the potential answers behind me, all I could do is lay in the mud and fight my exhaustion to behold another tragedy in process. Officer Harry Jackson, iconoclast, counterculturalist, deviant, now staring at the masochistic fiend insistently slamming on a front door just to make his hero's mark on society. They've lied to us. They've shaped us. They've defined us. I felt my body sinking as I closed my eyes. Just as the rain and knocking began to compose a cadence of symphonic order, I began to drift into a sleep. In my passive state, I swear I heard the striking of the doors cease, met by a frustrated greeting, and then absolute silence. I'm on what appears to be an uninhabited island. Birds are singing proudly while clear waters wash the sun-bathed sand. The sky is scarce in clouds, mirroring the scant oasis trees. I feel at one with the serenity of the island. I have no desire to prepare for the inevitable hunger, nor shelter. I'm at peace, isolated and serene. I sit on the shoreline and bask in the mild sun rays as I scan the horizon. Ships in the distance. They close in quickly. Dark clouds of sorrow lay low above them, tracking their every movement. Upon reaching the beach, the sky crackles with lightning as the downpour begins to raise the shorelines. Countless ships containing confused souls begin to flood the island. Not one of them uttered a word, but the expressions of their face tell the tale of confusion. The mass of silent people intrude the trees and surround every serene square foot. Then I hear it. A distant, singular voice.
Hello? Hello?
I can't find who is so bold as to speak. I'm surrounded by clueless others turning and searching for the voice.
Hello?
Something checks inside me.
Hello?
That demanding voice, that single, borderline desperate voice.
Look at me. Look at me.
The man continues to crackle in desperation, and I feel it's time to stop looking for him.
Look at me.
Another voice arises.
Look at
What
me.
is happening?
Sir,
Another,
look at me. Look at
then
me.
another.
Excuse me?
New, panicked people finding their voices and shouting wildly for attention. I don't know why, I don't know how, but I must avoid them.
Excuse me?
They continue to multiply, desperately seeking someone to validate their existence.
Look at me. Look at me.
I make my way towards what I'm certain is the center of the island. Bodies are still streaming off the ships. More.
Look at me.
More. I just stare down at the ground with my hands in front of me to avoid collisions. Something's not right.
Excuse me?
They're everywhere now. I paused and,
Look at me.
just for a moment,
Look at
I look up.
Excuse me?
Hundreds of men, women, and children, as far as I can see, are standing, staring desperately at one person. Me. Without a moment's notice, like rabid animals, they plunge at me.
Look at me. Look at me. Look at me. Get up. Sheer pain jolted through my calves as my eyes dilated in the mid-morning sun. Harry, up and at 'em.
Inspector Garner's voice was characteristically stoic and concerned as he supported me to my feet.
Where did you go wrong, son?
I said nothing.
Look, Harry, you're covered in mud, passed out in the middle of who knows where. I mean, when's the last time you changed your clothes? Forget it. You need to get home. Let me give you a ride home. You can wash up and call me when you're in a little better shape.
I stood, hunched yet defiant, and at a loss for words.
All right, come on, son.
There was an unexpected force when he grabbed my underarm and pulled me towards the squad car. I ripped myself away from him, causing my legs to buckle and collapse into the puddled mud.
Don't make me do this, Harry. Don't make me pull your badge. You're like family. But I'll do it to protect this family. To protect your family. How's Mallory? Don't talk about my wife, Garner. Don't ever talk about Mallory. We're not asking for your help. We don't need it. You sure about that, Healy? 'Cause your wife apparently begs to differ. She called the precinct this morning. She was asking about you. I've got half the force scouring the city. I mean, dumpster diving. Healy, it seems to me you need all the help you can get. Look, I know why you're here. All right, I saw the case repository. Heather Bennett?
I froze, staring intently at the ground.
Is that what this is all about?
I'll walk home.
Garner, we can talk after I get some sleep.
Garner hesitated briefly.
You know, Healy, I had to lock 2 people up in St. Cecily's Asylum last week. 4 the week before that. Only 1 has been rehabilitated to my knowledge and let back into society. Harry, there aren't many fringe radicals left. It's time you stop toying with fate. It's not a fad anymore. This device,
he held up the mod fastened around his wrist.
It's saving lives.
And there are tons of legislative lasers focused at the last of the defectors. He turned and began to walk towards his vehicle before pausing.
Sicily Asylum. They're filling up with these defectors.
I don't have a say in the matter.
Get this figured out, or you'll be rehabilitated with the rest of them. Fight it all you want, Healy, I don't care.
You're gonna end up with a mod. You can choose to ignore the thing if you want, but this is the new reality, Healy. I raised my head to lock eyes with his just as he closed his door and rolled down his window.
Get some sleep, then call me. I'll give you 4 days to make a decision. Either way, they're coming for you, detective.
I forced myself to my feet and regained my composure. The neighborhood was still calm. Garage doors were open, children were on bicycles, splashing through the puddles in the street, a few of them waving goodbye at Garner as he drove away, and then turned to gawk at me. The serenity of it all. It sang a lullaby from a distant past, one of wonder and carefree anticipation, one of fascinating and unrealistic expectations. I can only imagine what they thought of the filthy man, drenched and hunched over, and their fantastic imaginations. Amanda? Amanda Dell? The door was cracked open after only a few taps. Bright green eyes peered through a crack in the door. She said nothing. My name is Officer Harry Jackson, and I'm with the NYPD. I was assigned the case of Heather Bennett. I weakly turned my body and pointed to the curb where her body was found. I'll cut to the chase. You knew Heather, didn't you?
Sir, I've already given my statement to the police.
I've read it, Amanda. You said something that struck me as deeply personal. I need to know if you spent any time with Heather before she passed. Something's not adding up, and I was hoping you could help me out. The door widened, only enough to reveal a little bit more of her face. She hesitated before speaking.
I shouldn't be talking to you. We shouldn't be dwelling on what happened to Heather. But You're right. Something isn't adding up. I worked with Heather. I wouldn't say a close friend, but a friend, you know? She lost her job a few weeks before she died, couldn't come in on time, and when she did, she'd get sent home to sleep. I tried to keep in contact with her. I did, but she started to get...
She paused and looked down.
She started to get scary.
Scary?
Yeah, like she'd purposely freak us out with stories about people dying. The night she died, I had invited her out with a few friends. I knew she'd deny it. When I got home, she was on my porch, dressed up. I think she wanted to go out with us, like the old days. She wanted to... She was balled up, holding her legs and weeping. We went in, and I listened to her delirious stories for a long time before I kicked her out and went to bed. It was a few hours later that I got woken up by the police, and there she was, in the street, dead.
Amanda, what was Heather saying to you the night she died? What sort of delirious stories was she telling?
She kept talking about someone that was going to kill her, a stalker or something. He apparently confronted her once. She kept saying, "He's coming for me." Her mom was murdered, you know, only a few weeks before she was. No one talks about it. No one even cares.
Amanda's eyes drifted to my wrist and then back at my face.
You're just like her, aren't you? You need to leave. I don't care who you are. There are innocent folks dying because of people like you. I won't be the next. Don't ever come back here.
Reason is only a single performer in the theater of this mortal coil, many times playing only a supportive role through the opening, each act, and the final curtain call. Emotion and faith, passion, tradition, and reason, one overtaking another to define each play as either a comedy, a tragedy, or simple history. Reason has been pulled off stage and was waiting in the wings until this moment. My tragedy is approaching its finale, and Reason will have the last words. The vision of the Cheshire Man in the photo, it began to render into a broader view. Her image, Heather, shared with the evening news. The passivity about the deaths that I was witnessing all around me. Admittedly, Heather's mom, I'd missed that one completely, but I now understood that it was not only my life in danger, but my wife's, and I needed to get home. My home was humming with uncertainty as I stepped through the threshold and shouted for Mallory. No response. The setting sun played marionette to my shadow as I paused to strategize. If she wasn't here, she'd surely answer her phone, grateful to know I was safe. But if she didn't answer, I could call Garner, see if he'd pity me enough to help. If he didn't answer, well, I wasn't quite certain who I could turn to. I'd be alone. I gave another cry for my wife before frantically dialing and redialing Mallory, leaving multiple desperate voicemails. Mallory, it's Harry. I need you to come home. If you get this, I really need to talk to you. I've discovered something. Mallory, it's me. Please pick up. Look, I'm sorry for not contacting you the last few days. We need to talk. Call me back. Mal, if I don't see you again, just know I still love you. Garner's reluctant voice was drowned out by music and excited yelling as he answered the phone. I broke into exasperated plea before he could finish greeting me. "Garner, I need you at my house as soon as you can make it, please. Mallory isn't home. Something isn't right. I'll explain when you get here." The slam from the phone seemed to echo through the living room. At the very core of my being, I could feel something wasn't right. With no precise clues as to what was about to transpire, I shouted for Mallory and ran madly upstairs to my bedroom, where you're undoubtedly currently reading these very words. In a feverish dash, I did the only thing I could think to. I retrieved my 9mm duty gun, verified the magazine was full, and loaded a round into the chamber. I posted myself between the bed and the window, breathing deeply to calm my hands and my heart rate. I was ready for whatever might have walked through that door, never giving a moment's thought to it being Garner or Mallory. Hypothesis and abstract ideas swirled in my mind. I'm on the list. Whomever's list it might be. I'm just a pawn in this very twisted game. I am the illness that infects society, and someone is acting like the medical practitioner. But I see it still. I still see the light. The hope for future generations. Darkness doesn't grow. It's the dominant light that gets extinguished to avail the darkness. I'm not a plague. I'm a singular beam of light in the murky blackness of the dusk. The semblance of rationality and individuality. The remnants of humanity lost. No, I'm not a plague. I am the antibody. The streetlights flickered on as the sun's final rays waved their farewell beyond the horizon. There, basking in the glow of a spotlight, he stood. The man that I had unknowingly anticipated. The Cheshire Man. The extinguisher of the diseased. He stood opposite of my home, his tattered clothes and top hat awkwardly angled, staring at his illuminated wrist. He did not quiver in the slightest. My handgun began to sweat to the floor as I clamped down all the harder. I could feel my heart beat in the steel as I found it difficult to find a cadence to my breathing. With the bedroom light off, I stood in my bedroom window just staring, once again affixed on the monster and his moment of demise device. He was utterly captivating in every way imaginable.
Harry?
Mallory's voice. Both relief and trepidation flooded my senses as I heard the side door slam shut.
Harry?
I turned, only for a moment, to answer my wife. My voice escaped me as I gasped for a response.
Harry, can you give me a hand? I grabbed some groceries. Also, I really need to talk to you too. Can you come down here? Please?
I made a quick break for the door when, out of my peripherals, I caught a glimpse of a vacancy where the Cheshire Man stood, only moments ago. I paused and pivoted again towards the window. The streetlight flooded the dullness of the night, uncovering mere stillness outside my house. He was gone. The side door creaked open once again.
Excuse me, sir. Are you a friend of Harry's?
I exploded out of my bedroom and made my way to the stairs when I heard an explicit scream and then silence. Gun in hand, I stopped mid-staircase, just in time to see the man begin to crack his evil smile while staring at his mod. I drew my firearm and stood, face to grimacing face, with the man standing next to my wife's now lifeless body. He held a blade, today's method of administering vaccination to society. With darkness's beachhead further established, a flurry of emotions and sound exploded from within me. The gun made little sound as it ejected cartridges from the chamber. I watched as the Cheshire Man's disturbingly angled frame collapsed in a forceful, twisted manner. There was an eternity of silence as I stared at my wife and her murderer. Reader, it would be too difficult to explain the bewildered state in which I've been stranded in since this encounter. The interwoven complexities of watching my wife die a senseless martyr's death, like countless before her. I can't help but feel as though I'm wholly responsible. It could have been different. I could have complied with the pressures of social media, corporate mandates, the law. I'd still have my social status, my job, my wife. But isn't that what they've all said? Isn't that what you said when you made the decision to comply, even to the very loss of wonder and humanity? Who are we, reader? As you've undoubtedly come to realize, I've written these words immediately following my encounter with the Cheshire Man. Please excuse the blood trails and stains on my parchment. I'm uncertain if he felt my rabid pummels after discharging my weapon, but it was cathartic all the same. I do wonder how they'll spin these words that I've penned. It's contingent on you now, reader, to place this message into the right hands. Do you remember what they've told you? Remember how you've been told repeatedly that submission brings self-governance. Liberty comes through bondage. I refuse to be held captive, and I pray you do too. What ought to be cannot be determined solely from a singular statement or view of what is. And in light of this, I will offer to you a second story, one told in a moment, an instant. The mod that has now been affixed to my wrist once belonged to a man that haunted me. It held no calculated reasoning for the sudden loss of his life, I'm certain of that. This algorithm will not own my demise. I alone am a master of my own fate. I'm certain that I'm no hero. I've never added a second to anyone's life. I've only ever cleaned up the debris of passion and self-preservation. I can't figure out if I'm the protagonist anymore, and I don't care to stick around much longer to find out. But let it be known, there is no data-driven analysis that has held me hostage. No social engineering that has claimed my life. Sir, you gonna be all right? There was a concern in the officer's voice. What a mess. Inspector Garner held up the crimson-stained writings and stared at Harry Jackson. The ramblings of an insane man. A real shame. He was a good guy. Garner sat down and exhaled. There was a moment of silence before he pointed at the Smith & Wesson MP9. Issued firearm? Yes, sir. Let's get some of this. He waved his hands around generally. In for analysis. Mallory needs some vindication. I can't understand how he could do this to her. You think it was Harry that did this to her? All I know is I've got 2 corpses and some conspiratorial babbling. Yeah, okay. I'll make sure it's taken care of. The officer took a final look at Harry, lifeless at the desk, shook his head, and left the room. You thought you could save the world, Healy. Make a statement. You don't even know whose feet you were stepping on. Then again, we're all a little mad down here.
Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Gray Matters Podcast. I really hope you've enjoyed it and would consider giving me a positive rating or even becoming a Patreon supporter of the show. This helps me to continue producing the memorable stories that you love on a consistent basis. Being a sustaining supporter has some pretty cool perks, including regular giveaways, exclusive forums for writers and fans of the show, chances at having your stories hosted on Gray Matters, and access to exclusive interviews and workshops with me, the writer and producer of the show, Brandon Kenyon. Become a supporter today at www.patreon.com/Gray Matters Podcast. And remember, that's GREY Matters Podcast. You can also find us on the web at www.graymatterspodcast.net for our online store and some other great resources. Look, we love what we do, and it's a tremendous amount of work. The creative writing, the original music, the obsessive editing and producing. But honestly, it's worth every second put into making something if it brings out a smile, a laugh, maybe a tear, a sense of wonder, momentary terror, or spurs conversations in our listeners and supporters. We do it for you, and we'd love to hear your thoughts or questions. Contact us directly by emailing contact@graymatterspodcast.net. Remember, that's GREY. Today's episode was written and produced by Brandon Kenyon. We hope that you'll be joining us next time for another episode of Gray Matters.